wire.
Yeah.
We would go along a road and pull the wire off a reel that was on the back of the Jeep.
Hmm.
And then we would throw it over into a side ditch so it wouldn't be run over by tanks.
Oh, okay.
When we came to a crossroad, because tanks would go across there and had half tracks, and of course they would cut the wire, and the Germans dropped shells into crossroads that would cut the wire. So we usually would try to find trees or telephone poles, and then we would run it up the telephone pole and pull it across the street, across the crossroad, and then back down to the ground on the other side.
Okay.
And we did not do that for driveways, but we did that for crossroads.
Okay.
That's the reason that we had to put some of it up in trees, because and sometimes in town we would hang it off of buildings and so forth.
Okay.
To keep it from being run over.
Did you have to climb up trees on a
Quite a few
often?
trees, yes. We did climb trees, and we used climbers just like telephone linemen do. And so I've climbed a lot of bark trees, and as we could get up to the lower limbs, and then we could climb up in the limbs from there on. But usually we just needed to get to the lower limbs.
And then from there you could bring yourself on up. Okay, so most of your time, most of your days were spent doing that, stringing telephone line. Did you ever see combat at all before the day that you actually were wounded?
Occasionally, we would come on skirmishes that were going on. For instance, I remember a town where we were about 300 yards from a town, and the Germans came into that town, and there was a firefight between our men and the Germans in that town. Our men had to surrender because this was during the Bulge. They were vastly outnumbered, so they surrendered, and we pulled back. I met a man that came to our church one time, and he told me that he was captured, and I said, "Where were you captured?" And he named the name of that town, and I said, amazingly, I was about 300 yards from that town and saw you all captured.
Oh, wow.
He was an H company of our regiment.
So I don't really know that much about how the military works. Were you back behind the people that were fighting? You were sort of...
Yeah, we didn't get to the front line very often. It's just that sometimes the front line was fluid enough that we would
suddenly find
ourselves on the front line, and we'd pull back because we weren't supposed to be there.
In that situation, did you have your gun out and ready?
Had it in the Jeep, but it wasn't our job to be shooting. It was our job to be stringing telephone
wire. Okay. Tell me about, I think I've heard you talk about riding along on mountain roads on those, on the back of a army vehicle, in a kind of getting thrown from one side to the other.
Well, that was always a problem. I was usually driving if we were in trucks, and the problem about being in trucks is that going uphill, trucks can't keep up with Jeeps, so the Jeeps would get way ahead of us, and the company commander, who would be in the lead Jeep, would be radioing us back to catch up. Well, we couldn't catch up because they were going uphill, and then he would slow down going downhill, so we couldn't get up our speed to get ready for the uphill climb, the next one. So that was a problem that we had in driving trucks. We did have one funny situation when we were, it was fairly close to the time that I was wounded. A German ambulance took the wrong road and was coming up the hill toward our line, and our ambulance driver took the wrong road and was going down toward the German line, and they passed one another, and they realized what had happened, and so they both made U-turns and came back and saluted one another and went on back to their own lines.
Did you ever have other moments like that when you ran into German soldiers by accident or in a non-combat situation and you had to...
We were fighting in the city of Würzburg, which is not well known in America, but Würzburg is a fairly principal city of Germany. We were pinned down in Wurzburg because the Germans were in the sewers.
Oh.
And so they would lift up the iron sewer caps and shoot at us and then drop the caps and go back down, you know. And so they were really hitting a lot of our men that way. So we looked for the heaviest men in the regiment, the fat men, and we put them on the sewer caps and said sit on them so the Germans couldn't lift them up and shoot at us.
Now, how did that happen? Like, where were you? Were you back behind the main fighting?
Well, that was in the city of Wurzburg, so I was in a Jeep and I was trying to avoid those skirmishes, but when Germans could pop up out of the sewer,
you couldn't avoid it.
You couldn't predict where they were going to come from.
Whose idea was it to have the heavy guys go sit on?
You know, I can't remember it was probably Jay Ayer's idea because he was the one that could usually come up with cute ideas.
What was his? He was also in your.
He was in my wire squad, so he was with me.
Were you both the same rank?
Yes, we were PFCs.
Sometimes it seems like you guys got to make a lot of decisions on your own, like you kind of had to.
Well, you have to because there's nobody around you can ask, you know.
Sometimes you're kind of off by yourself.
And we had our communications officer, Lieutenant Bergeron. We didn't ask him anything because he was drunk all the time.
He was just drunk all the time. How did he carry liquor around with him in a?
Listen, we liberated a whole warehouse full of schnapps and. That's potato schnapps and champagne, and so most of the guys threw away their gas masks and poked all the liquors in their gas mask carriers.
Took it along with them.
And took it along with them. Of course, neither Jay nor I was drinking, so we weren't being bothered with all that.
Was that frustrating when other guys would be making poor decisions? Let us say. Because they were drinking
Yes,
so
it
much?
was very frustrating, especially if it was a sergeant. Sergeant Booth was one of our favorite men, but he was always drunk also. And he knew that he was not competent to make good decisions, and so he pretty well let us make our own decisions.
Do you think a lot of people became alcoholics during the war? And do you think a lot of people drank partly because of just the pressure of being over there and in uncomfortable situations? And
well, you'll do anything to sort of deaden your feelings to things, especially when it's cold. The alcohol you think is warming you up. Actually, it's opening up the pores of your skin, so it's not doing much good. But
made him feel good for a little while.
We thought it was antifreeze for our blood system.
Yeah.
I did not drink, but another thing that we got into in that sort of a situation was that you don't have an officer around that you can ask advice of or command for, so you made your own decisions. And when I was wounded, our squad leader, Bob Castle, was killed. Well, he didn't die right there, but he died the next day in the aid station. We got him back to the aid station, but he was in shock. So it was the same as though he died the same time he was shot. He was shot in the stomach. You know, you never thought about it. You just did what you had to do. You know, everybody did
made
that.
The next step. Go ahead and talk about that day. Like, tell me the story from the time when Bergeron or whatever ordered you to go into that town.
Well, we came to the command post, and he was there, and he told us that about up the road, about 2 or 3 miles, was a town called Urbach, and he sent us up there to find the command post of our 1st Battalion, which was, according to him, was already there. And so we came into this town of Urbach, and our 1st Battalion was not there. There was a German machine gun kind of hidden in some farm buildings on the right. And they opened up on us, and they hit the Jeep. They hit the radiator of the Jeep, and so of course, all the antifreeze drained out of our radiator, and then so we knew that the Jeep was going to overheat. And then they did something and the engine stopped, so we had to get out of there. So Bob Castle got out on the right side.
It was just the two of you, right?
Huh?
It was just the two of you.
No, there were two more. There was
Oh, okay.
Jay Ayers and Frank Rastelli
Oh, okay.
that were with me, and Frank Rastelli wasn't injured in any way. Jay Ayers fell out of the Jeep and he broke some ribs and broke his elbow and had a concussion.
Hmm.
But he was able in time to get up and head on back to the town that we had been sent from. And then I had Bob Castle on my hands, and so I kind of helped Bob and dragged Bob back to a creek bed that was probably 30 or 40 yards back away from the Germans, from where our Jeep was. And we got in cover there because the Germans, since we were in the bed of the creek, the Germans' flat trajectory fire couldn't do us. They tried to drop mortars on us, but they were too distracted because by this time our 1st Battalion was in the attack.
Oh, okay. So at that point, other soldiers had come in?
Yes, other soldiers were, well, we didn't see them, but we could see the flat trajectory, the rifle fire going over, and machine gun fire going over our heads.
Okay.
Bob was in shock, and so I stayed there with him. And then Johnny Hodgin, who was the chaplain's assistant and had a Jeep, came up with his Jeep and under cover of the fire from the Germans and the 1st Battalion in the attack, he was able to he commandeered a lieutenant from a tank destroyer that had been knocked out, brought him, and those two men were able to get Bob Castle onto a stretcher, and they got me into their Jeep.
Now wait a minute, you didn't tell about when you got shot though. At what point did you feel the bullet?
As soon as I got out of the Jeep, I felt the bullet.
In the back of your leg?
And yes, and this is exactly what it felt like. If somebody took a broomstick and hit you as hard as they could in the back of the leg, you know, it would sting, burn, hurt, whatever. And that's what it felt like.
Okay.
But fortunately, the bullet did not break any arteries, and it did not break any bones, and so I was still able to I wasn't lying there. I was still able to walk. My legs stiffened up very quickly, but I was back in that creek bed by the time that happened.
Okay, and you didn't go into shock?
No.
Okay.
It's interesting because I knew that God had already called me to preach, and I was arguing with God because I assumed that lying there in that creek bed I was going to bleed to death. I wasn't really bleeding that hard, but you think you're going to bleed to death anyway. Sure. And I said, God, why in the world did you call me to preach if you brought me out here into this place to let me die? But I didn't die. He sent Johnny Hodgin, the chaplain's assistant, up there to rescue me. And Johnny Hodgin and the lieutenant both got silver stars for that, and I thought they really deserved it.
Yeah. Which lieutenant?
The lieutenant that he got from
commandeered
from the tank destroyer that had been knocked out.
And you got a Bronze Star.
Yes, I got a Bronze Star, but to be honest with you, I didn't think I deserved it. I think the lieutenant wanted them to give it to me to cover his own ineptitude, just between you and me.
Well, what about the fact, though, that you dragged Bob Castle out of fire? You stayed with him. There was bravery in that.
Yeah, but I didn't think that.
That's okay. You don't have to.
That was not bravery. That was desperation.
That's what a lot of times I think that the two are the same. But so you, after that, they sent you back. Were you sent back on a truck or an airplane, or how did you get back to the hospital?
Okay, well, they took us back to the aid station where the CP was from which I had been sent to Erbach, and they cut my leg open in about 8 inches and sprinkled penicillin in it to keep infection from getting. And then they put me on an airplane. That was my first airplane ride.
Oh, really?
Put me on an airplane that was stripped of seats, and there were racks for stretchers,
Mm.
and so there were a number of us that were, must have been 10 or 12 of us at least on that plane. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And they took us back to Reims, France,
Oh, okay.
and that was where the nearest hospital was where they could take care of us.
How long were you in the hospital?
I think about 6 weeks.
Okay. Okay.
I was wounded on the 9th of April, and I think it was about the 20th of May when I was released from the hospital to go back to my company.
Were you sad to miss out on some of the action, or were you happy, or did you have mixed feelings?
Oh, I wanted to get back to the company.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's where my friends were, you
right,
know.
yeah. That's what I've heard people say before. They didn't want their buddies to be without them. They wanted to get back and help.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it seems to me, okay, so tell me about the living in a foxhole, you and Jay, the story you were talking about yesterday.
We dug a foxhole. This was in a period of time after the bulge and before we were ready to jump off in the final attack. So we knew the Germans were close enough to send artillery down on us. So we dug this hole, and to keep artillery from shrapnel from coming down on us, we covered it up with logs, and then we put dirt on the top of the logs, and then we kept on improving that foxhole underneath there. We cut shelves in the walls so we could put our shaving gear and that sort of thing, and put our mess kit and our coffee. You know, what am I trying to say?
Coffee pot or something?
No, what we drank our coffee from. It was part of our gear, our mess gear.
Okay.
And so all the time that we were there, we were continually improving it.
Did you say you created bunks?
It's amazing that was a hole in the ground, and we got attached to it, and when the order came for us to leave it, we really felt homesick for it.
Huh.
It's amazing.
The hole. Did you have a name for it besides the hole?
No, I don't think we had a name for it, but we went back there, and we took Mary and Jay's wife Betty with us, and we agreed where it was, and we parked the rental van that we were in, and we went over there, and it was where we expected to find it. It's amazing that we agreed. This is it. Yeah, this is it. Yeah.
Talk about going back years later, or in that same trip, to the place in France where you'd been shot. Or was it France or Germany?
It was actually in Germany where we were shot, and we were standing there. Jay and I were standing there. We were showing our wives where the machine gun was and where the creek bed was, and we're talking about it, and a young German man came up and asked if we were having car trouble, and we said no. He could speak English because by that time they were teaching English in the schools. He asked if we were having car trouble, and we said no, that this is where we were wounded during the war. And he said, you were the guys that were wounded here? And we said, yes. So he said, well, wait right here. He said, I want to go get my grandmother. So he went and got his grandmother and brought her, and she had lived in the farm where those outbuildings were, where the machine gun nest was. And she had seen the whole thing. She had looked out the window and seen the whole thing.
Wow.
And so she was thrilled to death to meet us, you know. And we got our picture taken with her. In fact, she had a daughter who married an American soldier from Tulsa, Oklahoma. So she had been to America had been to Tulsa. And so she felt like she was part of the family.
Had she been a person that felt liberated by the war, in the war, or not? I can't.
Well, you know, everybody felt liberated after the war was over. Nobody was on Hitler's side when the surrender came.
Yeah. I'm sure at that point the Germans were as sick of him as everybody else.
That's right, and of course they didn't want to be punished as war criminals.
Yeah. although there were some. Talk about when you led Jay Ayers to Christ. Was
Yes.
it in the hole? That one we were talking about?
We were when we first landed on French soil. We went in at Marseille, and we were that first. It was cold and rainy. It was
not the way you think of Marseille.
Oh no, not at all. But anyway, we dug a foxhole, and then we pitched our tent because the Germans had fled, and they were a day or 2 days ahead of us. Then an airplane flew over, and we didn't know whether they're ours or theirs. But anyway, everybody was shouting, "Air raid, air raid." So Jay and I were in our tent. And just about the time that we were going to get out of our tent and get into our foxhole, we heard Lieutenant Bergeron say to the captain, our company commander, said, "Captain, here's a hole no one's in." So they went into our foxhole.
Oh no.
So we just stayed where we were.
But you were above ground.
Yes. And he said, if that plane had dropped a bomb on us, where would you be now? And I said, I'd be in heaven. Why? He said, oh, you think you're so much better than I am. And I said, no, I don't think I'm any better than you. You don't go to heaven, Jay, because you're better than somebody. You go to heaven because you have Jesus in your heart. And he said, where'd you get that? And I said, in the Testament. And so he said, well, I'll have to see it. And so I had a Testament in my pocket, and I showed it to him. And so he said, well, how do I get it? And so I said, well, you pray. And so he said, well, I don't know how to pray. And I said, I'll be happy to pray with you if you will repeat after me and mean it. And he said, well, I'm ready to mean it. So he prayed after me, and he invited Christ into his life. And the next morning, he was telling everybody that he had been saved the night before.
Yeah,
I mean,
he's very serious about
and
it.
that he said, Smartt saved me last night. And then nobody would get close to me.
Yeah, that night. The plague.
Didn't want me saving them.
Was that the first person that you led to the Lord?
That's the first person that I know that I led to the Lord. I witnessed to a lot of people, but I had never had the success of winning anybody to Christ.
Do you think your experience in the war made it easier for you to tell people about, just encountering death and all that? I wondered if it made it easier to talk to people about ultimate things, important end of life things.
Well, there's a lot of talk about foxhole religion, and everybody thought that's what it was for Jay. But Jay is still going on with the Lord. He reads 3 chapters of the Bible every day, and he goes to church every Sunday, and he's the largest contributor to his church, and he's solid with the Lord to this day. I don't know. I used to talk to Bob Castle about the Lord, but he was not interested. Of course, he was the kind of guy who thought that he could never be killed or injured because he just, everybody until they're shot once, they think they're invincible.
At least at that age.
Yeah.
Guys at that age.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Huh. Well, I can't think of any other questions. Do you have any? Or you want to go ahead?